Good morning, YouTubers. Today is the 27th, and I haven't posted anything in a couple days because it's been, we're kind of at a turning point with this anime, in the sense that it does not really make sense to continue with more pencil tests into the next sequence, because what we'd like to do is take what's been developed thus far and is in various stages of completion and package it into an episode, because it's about 5 to 6 minutes of content that sort of launches the story and gets it moving. And it would seem that we're going to try to develop this as a free YouTube thing and see if we can develop an audience that way. Now, my suspicion is, I will say, if you look at this graphic, anm8.me, okay, I'm not gonna go officially on the record, but I think this is going to be the home for the show itself. So I'm making a distinction between Blended Planet, which is where you're at right now, where you're seeing this behind the scenes stuff, and over the next few months I expect to transition in two different ways. One would be animate.me would be the home for the actual anime property and any other properties that might be developed going forward. So that would be the home base for the anime business entity, if you will. Then I expect to also develop 2D animation how-to.com, which would be more oriented towards the obvious, which is how to do traditional 2D animation. And those both have YouTube channels that are set up but aren't, I've created them, but I haven't really done anything with them yet. But that's where, so the show itself would be animate.me. How to do 2D animation would be at 2danimationhowto.com. And this location, Blended Planet, remains what it is, at least on YouTube, this is my forum to talk about the behind the scenes process of doing whatever the heck it is I'm doing. Okay, so now let's bring the project up to date. Because we are at the point where we're ready to get into editing and assemble the show, then I had to go back and look at some of the earlier scenes that were in various states of completion, and just add some tweens here and there. In this case, for example, with this clip, I was just tightening up the timing of Akari breathing. While I go over some things today that would bring you up to date as my subscribers, I will say that I'm going to also mention some feature requests that I'd like to see in OpenToonz that I think I'm going to carefully compile my feature requests into a short list that I can pass on to the developers, because I suspect that I'm bumping into functionality that, as I've kind of alluded to at different times in the past, if you're just kicking the tires of OpenToonz, you're probably not going to bump into some of the things that I bump into with a project of this scope. And getting into that workflow deeply tends to bring to light some, maybe deficiencies or ways of working that could be improved in the software. So, where to begin? Well, first of all, let's go ahead and go back a bit here. I'm going to load scene here and let's just go to this one. Okay, this is the scene that literally opens the show, and it certainly, okay, now that's interesting. Okay, that's actually super interesting. That cartoon right there is a bug. That's something that OpenToonz was not supposed to put in there. So that's concerning because and we bumped into this before. It brings to mind the question of what's been destroyed. And of course, this always happens whenever I start creating YouTube videos. All of a sudden, things start breaking. So, yeah, and that is exactly what happened. So let me show you. This actually points right to one of those feature bug kind of situations that I knew would arise. Okay. So first of all, what you're seeing right here, there is no excuse for this at all. This is utterly ludicrous that this should even be possible to happen. But what happened was I created well, actually, let me see here. I can probably bring it up. Yeah, right here. So we'll just discard the changes for now. So this is actually a great example of what can happen. So I was messing around with timing in OpenToonz and keyframing and tweening, just fine-tuning how I want to go about dealing with needing to smooth out motion, getting from here to there. What I've arrived at is kind of a 4 levels of priority approach. Level number 1 is do your tweening at the pencil test stage. Get all the tweens figured out when it, doesn't matter as much. The interface with OpenToonz is very simple because you're just doing a pencil test. It's typically just one level, and you can cut your character into pieces if you want to and rearrange things in order to generate tweens that way. And that would be priority number 1. Priority number 2 would be once things are inked and painted to go ahead and use the selection tool to cut it into pieces and then basically use ink and paint to patch any gaps that you create. The third priority for tweening would actually be the animate tool. And oftentimes that requires cutting a character into pieces as well. If I wanted to, if this character, for example, had a body, then it would not be at all unusual to want to cut the head away from the body and animate them separately but link them together through the schematic. Now, of course, you could argue that isn't that something you should plan for? And do a little bit of the puppet animation thing by cutting the character into pieces from the get-go. And yeah, that's true that that's oftentimes a good way to proceed, but in reality, a lot of times you don't quite see ahead of time what those changes need to be in terms of how you have to break things up in order to get the tweens that you want. If you do it at the pencil test, typically you're going to probably get the right results. So that's definitely the preferred option. So what's interesting about this here today is that I created these 4 drawings. I was just doing some quick sketches to get some differences in the face, and then I was using that in conjunction with the animate tool to just see how different types of tweening would behave. And what do I mean by that? See, it sounds like a bunch of gibberish. Well, in your preferences, you can set in your animation preferences right here, you can set the animation steps. So this is set at 2, and that means that if I were to, for example, hit the animate tool, sorry, I need to be here. Okay, if I hit the animate tool and I go from here to here, because that number is set to 2, OpenToonz is only going to figure out interpolated steps in between every 2 frames. Okay, so if I had a keyframe that was immediately adjacent, I believe it would respect that. But when there are keyframes that are further apart, the interpolation is only going to be calculated every 2 frames. Okay, so 2 is a good number for that because it means you're on 2s most of the time, but if you want to, you can manually insert keyframes that force it to 1s. So that's not a bad way to work. So that's what I was doing here, and I simply did save all and didn't bother to change OpenToonz projects. Well, what happened as a result, what you're seeing here in real time right now today, we've discovered, which is pretty annoying, is that OpenToonz got confused and saved these images in such a way that it overwrote the this. I think it's this level right here. Let's find out. Actually, if I can see the fox now, that means that it didn't overwrite my birds, which is a good thing. So we'll figure out where the heck the fox is coming from here in a second. But okay, so stop right now. Here is another an example of a feature request that I think would be well advised for OpenToonz. Basically, here's the deal. If you have a timeline open here, like I do, and you also have another X sheet open, like I do here in another window, you'll notice that here on this X sheet, you're working the range of frame 126 to 162. Okay? What will happen is on the main timeline that has the focus, when I get to frame 162 or thereabouts, well, okay, let me clarify this. In the other window right now, the X sheet goes down to frame 120. Okay? So now what's going to happen is, instead of this timeline taking precedence, which meaning that I should be able to scroll across this full range, no problem, what will actually happen is once I get to frame 120, the X sheet in the other window will start to scroll, and it will force this timeline to start to scroll as well. Watch what happens. See? And it starts running away from you. Okay, I can't even imagine a scenario where that would be desirable behavior. What should happen is this timeline should only scroll when I get to the rightmost edge, and with whatever timing interface, whether it's X sheet or timeline, has the focus, that's the one that should take priority. Okay, so over here, let's just see what happens now if I scroll here. Okay, you can see the timeline down here scrolling, and it appears that whichever one has the smallest range takes precedence. That's what it looks like is happening here. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether it's an X sheet or a timeline. The behavior I'm showing is exactly the same with both. So if I click the old X box and close that other X sheet, now what happens is the behavior you would want, which is you can just scroll as much. So there's something that really probably should be addressed with OpenToonz, and I'm sure I want to be really, really careful to compile my feature requests in a concise manner and make sure that they're not things that already have fixes, so that I don't waste the developer's time. Okay, so what looks like is happening here, let me just see. Yeah. Okay, so what's happening is, for whatever reason, this is really bizarre, and it's easier to see with an X sheet, so let's go ahead and pop open an X sheet. Okay, what I did was I needed to control the camera, and the way I normally do that is I will create just a Toonz raster level or even a raster level and just draw a dot in the viewport so that it creates a picture and thus creates a level. So I've got this level that's called camera control. Okay, and all that's for is so that I can set keyframes, animation keyframes, and those keyframes, like this one right here, I'll be able to see them in the viewport. If you animate your camera directly, there is no way to visualize the animation keys unless you go to the function editor, which typically, if you're wanting to do it that way, you would probably also switch it to the function curves view, so you can, and of course you can't see it right now because there's no data, but function curves are certainly a good way to edit animation data, but it's a little clunky, and normally just going ahead and animating, you know, here in the X sheet is clean and simple, and you can get the results you want pretty readily that way. So I created this level called camera control. Now, I'm going to, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save all, and I'm going to delete this level and see what happens. And see if my animation still takes place. And it looks like it does. So again, this is kind of bizarre because I'm not really seeing where the camera control level is doing anything, and how OpenToonz took the level strip from a completely different scene and stuck it in here. You know, that kind of confusion about what data goes where is definitely a little concerning. But fortunately it didn't break anything. It's not a big deal. So okay, yeah, so you can see the monastery is moving a little closer. Okay, so this gets into the next topic I wanted to talk about today. People have asked me in the comments on YouTube about doing a 3D camera move. Okay, there's nothing wrong with doing a 3D camera move, and in fact, as you can see, OpenToonz has a nice interface for doing just that. Okay, and you can take each of these levels and move them in Z space, and then do a camera move in order to get a parallax effect. And this, in fact, this scene was done that way. Once I had done it, I felt that it was only sensible to try seeing if I could simplify it, because what happens is you make your camera move and then you discover that maybe one level or another is not positioned where you want it, and so maybe at the beginning and the end you find that you have to compensate. Okay, so this is the problem you'll run into, is you wind up with animation data stacked on top of animation data where you got your camera move, which in terms of what you see causes all the levels in the shot to move. Okay, I should probably illustrate this. Let me go ahead and illustrate it, because we might as well make this educational if we can. So here's the way this works. And by the way, I'm using I have not used the timeline in the past. I always stick with the X sheet. The reason I'm using the timeline is because it's a little more conducive to doing my drawings at the scale I like, which is basically kind of the native scale, which would be about here, and this screen arrangement kind of keeps most of the frame in the frame, all the time when I'm drawing. So that's the only reason for that. But let's just say we're going to do it this way. I'm gonna really whip this out in a hurry. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to put the sun in the background. Okay. All right. And now I am going to create a new Toonz raster level. And in that level, I'm going to put some mountains. Okay. I'm going to add another Toonz raster level. And in that level, I'm going to put a house. Okay. And finally, way in front in the foreground, I'm going to put a happy, shiny, smiling person who's looking at you. Okay. So now the question is, and that has come up before on YouTube, is how do you do, or why not do, a camera move in 3D in order to get that parallax effect. So let's just do that right now. It's really not too hard to do. You simply go to the 3D view, and now what you do looks something like this. I'm going to hit the animate tool, and I'm animating position, and I'm hitting the control key so I can move it in Z space, not X or Y. Well, X from your point of view, this is X and Y, and Z space would be this. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of keep this simple. I'm going to hit control, and because the smiley face guy is selected, if I just drag with control he's put out in front. So I'm just going to keep doing this. Put the house here. Put the mountains in the background. Let's move the house a little closer. And finally, let's move the sunshine way in the back. And then I'm just going to make a couple little adjustments here. Okay, so now I have the makings for some parallax, because as you can see, and I'm hitting Control Spacebar, by the way, to be able to dolly around like this. Okay, so now we go back to the camera view, and we can see a couple problems. And the problem is that when you move levels in Z space, because they're moving further away from the camera, in effect they become smaller. And if the basic scale of the initial drawing was correct, then you need to compensate for that. So now I'm going to use the scale option of the animate tool to go ahead and scale these levels up. And you can kind of see, based on their borders, all you have to do is get those borders back in the view, and you can be sure that you're back to pretty close to what your original drawing was. Okay, so now in order to do what we want to do with this, we need to select all of these guys, and let's just stretch them out to 60 frames. And now what we're going to do is animate the camera. Okay, so that's a little tricky. We need to go back into position mode, and as far as I know, the only way to do this is to go ahead and select the camera here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a parallax thing, so the camera is going to move laterally a little bit, but it's also going to zoom in. Okay, so let's keep it simple. I'm going to hit Shift and drag the camera to the left. Alright, and then I'm going to go to frame 60 and drag the camera to the right. And if you drag too hard, things really go crazy. So, okay, and now I'm going to hit Control so that the camera is pushing in a little bit, and then at the end of my little shot, my camera's pushing out a little bit. Okay, so what that does, as you can see, is it gives you parallax. Alright, because the camera's moving and everything else is changing its position relative to the camera. And so now we have pretty good, but we say, well, I really want my sun farther back in the background. I don't want the sun to move like hardly at all. Okay, so that means it needs to be like the sun is really far away, so it appears not to move, right, compared to things that are closer to the camera. Therefore, let's move the sun in Z space some more. So I'm going to select the sun, and I'm going to hit the animate tool. And again, this is where you want to be careful to make sure you're grabbing what you think you're grabbing and this sort of thing. So you don't set a bunch of animation keys that you didn't mean to set. So now I'm going to hit the animate tool, position, I'm going to hit Control, and I'm going to move the sun way, 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 way the heck back. Okay, and you can see that it's so far back that it's actually out of the clipping range of the 3D visualization camera. That's okay. Alright, so now what we need to do is compensate for that by scaling it up. So I'm again going to hit the animate tool and scale up this level. So now what should happen, I suspect, is the camera's going to move, but the sun's not going to move very much at all. And that's exactly what we see. Okay? So that's how parallax works, and it's really cool. So how can this be what about this layers of animation issue that I mentioned? Well, here's what can happen. It doesn't always happen, but it can. You might find yourself saying, well, yeah, but at the beginning of this shot, I really wanted my character guy to be here. I wanted him to kind of stay where he's supposed to be relative to the camera. So that means that now I've got to... So now what I've done is I've added a layer of animation data here on this guy that is on top of the camera move. In other words, if I got rid of the camera move for no apparent reason, my smiley face guy would still move over the 60 frames. So as long as you plan carefully and do a minimum of that sort of what I would call compensation animation, fine. But in practice, what often happens is you say, well, yeah, I mean, compositionally, I really wanted my house right in the middle. So now we're going to, okay, so now we've got to do this. Okay, and on it goes. And then what happens is you have layers of animation. It's not a problem until that key moment when you decide, well, I don't quite like the camera move after all. Okay, this is where everything goes to pot in a hurry. Because now I grab my camera and I say, well, I actually wanted my camera to be a little further this way, and I wanted it to sort of come up so that we see the sunshine. And then you go, well, wait a minute. The problem is I've got this layer of animation of my smiley face guy, and now he is not where I wanted him on that last frame. And so now I have to move him again. And what happens is you wind up with these multiple layers of animation on top of each other where because moving the camera makes everything appear to move, now you have to compensate for that in the specific layers. So this is the danger you can run into with camera animation for Parallax if you don't plan very carefully and make sure that you've set up your scene properly. Well, what's the surest sign that you've set it up properly? Well, it would be to go into the 3D view and have things look basically correct visually, where you say, yeah, I think sort of in real world units, this is kind of sort of what I would want. In my case, if I was going to do that, the first thing I'd be thinking is, well, actually, my smiley face guy needs to be really closer to the house, and the mountains are far behind, and the sun's really far behind. So you're sort of getting real world scale going on. So if you set it up improperly, and so your parallax, the upshot is it's really common to wind up having to do some compensation animation. So what's the lesson? What's the takeaway from that? Well, unfortunately, the takeaway is that most of the time it's not worth using camera animation to get parallax. It's actually more efficient and effective to simply scale the levels that you need to scale in order to make it look like you've got camera animation. So that's what I did here. I just set keyframes for the leaves in the foreground, and I just animated them, and then I just by scaling it up, and it made it pass out of the frame so you can't see it anymore. And so all I did was scaled the leaves a lot, I scaled the monastery a little bit, scaled the mountains a tiny bit, and I didn't scale the background with the moon at all. And so the result is that I had complete control over the amount of parallax that I wanted. Not saying it's perfect. I'm saying this was way less arduous to get a result that was pretty close to what I wanted than if I had done it with a 3D camera move. So those who have asked the question in the past to say, well, why not do it, with a 3D camera move, this is the reason why. In practice, it's usually more trouble than it's worth. Okay, so anyway, this is like the opening shot of the show, and what's kind of interesting about it is it was originally composed completely in reverse to what it is here. Let me just see here if I have I think I might have the old version. Yeah. Okay, so we actually had this, and there's an argument to be made for this being a better shot, actually, mainly because the monastery's in the center. But in the course of working this out, I happened to be playing this back in Blender, in the Blender video editor, and I just did an X flip, and I'm like, whoa, that feels better if everything's flipped and the birds are still flying from right to left, but everything else was reversed. If I'm not mistaken, I did not reverse the leaves. But anyway, that resulted in this bit of animation. And I guess one thing you could maybe, I'm gonna experiment right now while I'm here thinking about it, is I'm gonna take the monastery and I'm just going to move it slightly. Okay, now you see what happened here? Okay, this is an important thing. This is where you're going to get screwed by OpenToonz. So let me point this out. I just selected this level, but for whatever reason, and I don't know why, because it just did it now, you'll notice right up here that that level is selected to work with the animate tool. But a moment ago, even though I had selected the level, when I hit the animate tool was still had a different level selected. It wasn't the camera, it was actually the this level called flip. The flip level is a utility level I put in for the sole purpose of taking all the levels that needed to be flipped and flip them. Okay, so I don't know how deep to go sometimes with this stuff, because if you're super knowledgeable on OpenToonz, you might find this boring, but basically here's the deal. Here's the flip level, and then the mountain, the sky, and the monastery are all flipped. So if these levels were all going directly into the table, they would just be flipped. So anyway, so that's something to be aware of, that you want to just take note right here. Right now you can see the table's selected. Okay, yeah, and it seems to be switching, so that's good. So what I want to do is go to the end and just move the monastery. I'm going to hit shift so it's constrained. I'm going to move the monastery a little bit closer toward the center. And if I'm going to do that, it sort of suggests that probably its initial starting point needs to be a little bit more like that, which kind of respects the rule of thirds a little bit better. So let's go ahead and loop it and see if that looks okay. It does. It looks better, in fact. Okay. There may be some additional painting called for. I mean, I know there is in the mountains, but here in the foreground, I think there's some things I want to do with this area down here to basically block this off. So, do we want to do that right now? Actually, that's an interesting question, because I would have to do it in reverse. I wonder what happens. Let me hit the B key, and gosh, what do I want to grab here? Because I changed my layout here, things are a little bit different visually. Okay, so what's happening right now is when I click, the pop-up on another screen is showing me I can go to small thumbnails view, list view, yada 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 for the palette. And I want to say that it is not working. So I'm switching it to small. Now it works. That's weird. I switched between two different options and nothing happened. And now that I say it, it happens. Yeah, very weird. Let me look at style name. No, that doesn't. I guess. Okay, so normally I do small thumbnails. Okay, that's what I wanted. So I'm going to sample this color right here. And I'm gonna, okay, Control Z. Actually, on my computer it's just Z. Okay, what just happened? What just happened is I need to go back to the beginning here, because I automatically created a keyframe, which I did not want to do. Now, to be fair, I could disable auto keyframe automation for the purpose of what I'm doing right now, but it's simpler just to go back to the beginning. Okay, it looks like, yeah, that's definitely interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the picture and see what's going on. And we need to unmask. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I'm going to go ahead and see this through, because I think it's going to make the composition stronger, even if it's nothing more than just a simple silhouette. And then I may go back in and adjust some of the tonality, but basically, and I'm just gonna, most of this is in shadow, so it's not like you're really seeing it. You feel it more than you see it, actually, is what happens. And you know, I like hand painting. You know, it's organic. You getting in there and really drawing exactly what you intended, kind of thing. So let's go back here now and see. Yes, that is definitely better. And I'm actually going to put some sort of indications of a little something right here, maybe a town in the distance. But yeah, that definitely helped the composition. So now that we're, you know, we've made a change, let's talk about output, because this is actually, those of you who are really enthusiastic about open source software might be cheering me on when I tell you that I'm seriously thinking about doing the editing in Blender, in the Blender video editor, for reasons that will probably make sense as I discuss it. Okay. So the question becomes, where's my output coming from? And how am I generating the output? I've decided that dealing with image sequences is basically pretty cumbersome. And the OpenToonz ffmpeg MP4 rendering is both fast and very high quality. It basically creates an MP4 of the highest possible quality. So let's look at the preferences so you can see what I'm talking about. Because if you're doing animation and you want to generate video files for the purpose of having a simple editing scenario, it is, I mean, you can work with image sequences, and some people are really enamored of that and enjoy the pain of dealing with image sequences. But what I found is generally it's basically not worth it. Again, you seem to hear me saying that over and over, this or that isn't worth it. There are many pieces of this show that were in image sequence form earlier, and it introduces more clunk than convenience. Let's put it that way. The upshot is I want to output video files, and fortunately, if you point OpenToonz to the path of ffmpeg.exe, which I put it in my OpenToonz installation, I have a folder called res, stands for resources, and there's just things that are like little utility programs or whatever, or install programs that I know are associated with animation that I might want later, especially if I take this OpenToonz installation, which is portable, and move it to another machine. Everything goes with it. So that's where I put ffmpeg, and I put the fast render path at l/anime/render. Okay. So now what's cool about it is anytime I feel like a scene is looking pretty good and I've gotten it to where I want it to be, I just hit Alt-R and, you know, go get some coffee. Now this is a large scene, so this one's actually going to take a little longer than many to render. But even so, the rendering is generally pretty fast. Let me go ahead and cancel that, because if I'm not mistaken, the render folder, yeah, we still have it. It won't overwrite it until I already had this rendered, and it will not overwrite it until ffmpeg is invoked. Okay, so here's what I've done is I've generated these shots one by one as MP4 files, okay? And let me see here. Okay, actually I was wrong. It does look like what I just did broke this MP4 file. That's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete it. Okay, so getting back to the editing process, I've always edited movies in Sony Vegas. But there are some things about editing in Blender that do recommend it. Okay, so I'm going to go to this opening video edit, and you'll see that it appears there's nothing there. Well, here's the reason why. And I'm sharing this with you because when it comes to performance, this might be something that you want to know. A high quality MP4 looks good, but it's not super performant for editing because the MPEG format deals with clusters of frames, and therefore seek times are kind of slow. And so what that means, and keep in mind that Blender uses ffmpeg in the background for decoding and showing these video clips. But what it means is that when you click around in the interface, the system can really bog down. Blender can really start bogging down, trying to just find, it interrupts the editing process, okay? So let me go back to, I'm switching back to my default scene so that when I do what I'm about to do, I don't get an error. You'll see why in a moment. Okay. So in my render folder, which is where all my master videos of every scene are going to be kept. And by the way, while I'm talking about this, I'm going to regenerate the MPEG form. I'm going to let that run in the background. That's another thing that's cool about it is once you have a scene that's locked, you can go ahead and fire up the render and open another instance of OpenToonz and get on with other work. Okay. So now, the question is, these are all MP4 video files. Okay, as you can see, they play back fine with VLC. They actually play back fine with Blender. It's just like I said, the seek time thing is a little bit of a non-starter. So this is the solution I came up with. I dropped these MP4s into this folder, okay? And then what I did was I also dropped an instance of ffmpeg into this folder for the simple reason of not wanting to have any path issues, okay? I created this batch file. Now this is kind of ugly, but I'm going to break it down. Okay, for this section here basically says in batch file language to create a variable that contains a list of every MP4 that you find in the current folder. And then with that list of files, do this. ffmpeg, blah, 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 generate MJPEG files in the AVI package format. And you can use QuickTime. This could say .mov. Doesn't matter. It works just fine either way. So what that does for me is I can set OpenToonz loose generating MP4 files, and they just go in this folder, and then whenever I need to, I can just run this batch file like this, and what it's doing is it's generating really, really high quality MJPEG versions of all these video files. So now, and how long did that take? That took like 10 seconds or something, right? Okay, and so now what I can do is there's really no reason to keep these guys around. So I'm going to change the batch file. Actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this batch file, and at the end of it, I'm just going to add delete star dot MP4 because I really see no reason to keep the MP4 files around if I'm going to edit in MJPEG. So why did I choose MJPEG? Well, because that's kind of it's not a native format for Blender, but Blender's been really good with editing MJPEG files for 20 years. Your video files are going to be about let's see, what would it be? It's going to be a little less than twice as big, about 180%. So if you had a 20 megabyte MP4, that will turn into a 35 megabyte MJPEG. Well, you know, storage space isn't really my issue today, so I don't care about this space thing. So now when I open this, because I regenerated those AVIs, Blender can see them. And as you can see, one of them is still missing because OpenToonz is rendering it right now. But it's pretty performant. I mean, if I hit Alt-A, it's maintaining 24 frames a second, which is great. So what makes this a little better than Vegas? Well, one thing is I can do this. I can zoom in and really get a close look. I can select any clip, and Blender's got a number of, you can add modifiers for like color curves and things like that. So it's just, and plus it is cool to do the open source thing, right? So I'm kind of leaning towards just editing this thing in Blender, and I'm having fun doing it. And the other thing is, actually, and I'm not going to get into illustrating how you do this, but the other thing is, if you had some weird transition or something you needed to do, you could always just go to the 3D space, and for example, if I add a plane here in the 3D space, I can go ahead and grab my one of my images here and just drag it on there, and it just works. Now, that's not really true. It doesn't just work. If I want this to animate, there's a couple settings I need to set, but basically it just works. Okay. And so if you wanted to, you could obviously take image sequences and build up a composite in the 3D workspace. Plus you've got Blender's node-based compositing, so it's all right there in one package. And I've always loved Blender, even though I complain about 2.8's grease pencil. So now I'm going to go ahead and reopen this. But I mean, the upshot of the story is that MJPEG, I'm creating these at the highest quality possible, so it's visually lossless. If you zoom in really close, you're not going to see compression artifacting. Okay. So what the heck? Let's edit with Blender, and away we go. So I've got to put some crossfade transitions in here, and maybe in another video I'll show how to do that. But basically all of your editing capabilities that you could really want are definitely available in Blender. There's a few things I'm not sure about, like ripple editing. The ability to drag this way and have everything else move to the right as well. But basically the capabilities are all there, so it's like, geez, oh Pete, it took 10 seconds to convert these all into MJPEGs. This is done rendering. So let's take a look and see what we've got. We go back here. Okay, there's the only MPEG-4 in the folder. Watch this. Okay, it's creating an MJPEG, and it deleted the MPEG. So now, now look at that. In real time, now that's cool. In real time, just because the AVI file reappeared, Blender now has, I didn't even have to reload the project, right? So I would say that change I made definitely is helping in terms of the this part of the image. And so now we've got our camera move. You'll notice I have a post-production filter from OpenToonz putting the tree, the branches out of focus. Our birds pass through the scene. And I've got to clean up my edit point there. So then we zoom in. Okay, and now we actually have a problem here because there is a shot that's missing. We've got the wide shot, medium shot, and now we need to put the really close-up shot in there. So what I'm going to do, I think the way to do that would be to go, let's select nothing, and then hit the box, and just move these guys downstream. And now I got to remember if I actually rendered. No. Okay. So the super close-up of Akari is not rendered yet. So that's fine because there's something else I wanted to talk about while I'm here. Okay, this came up the other day, and the question was about multi-layer images. Okay. And why do I care about multi-layer images? Well, I'll show you. I'm going to load up Krita, and you'll see that the background image here, it was actually a multi-layer image that was created in Krita originally. Okay, so let me see if it's in the, yeah, right here. And this is obviously the reversed version. There's some things that have changed in it since then, but for illustration purposes, this does the trick. Okay, so initially what I did was I saved this as a Photoshop file, meaning .psd. OpenToonz can load PSD files, except the problem is it really can't. There are a plethora of problems that occur when you try to bring PSDs into OpenToonz. The biggest one being that, let's just look at these layers. Okay, the biggest one is that what it will do is this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers. What'll come into OpenToonz will be 5 instances of this layer. Okay, and it's cool that you can choose to load the layers of a PSD either across different levels in OpenToonz, or you can load them as a sequence if it worked, but it doesn't. So I'm like, what do I do? Now Oxer had commented, well gee Dave, you can load the PSD file into Clip Studio Paint and then export that natively as an OpenToonz format. And that's not the worst idea in the world, but I don't really like Clip Studio Paint and don't really want to keep it hanging around just for converting Photoshop files, especially when I have Photoshop 5 on all my machines, and if I really want to drop down to Photoshop and save a PSD that way, I can do so. And I have not even experimented with does a Photoshop file from Photoshop import into OpenToonz cleanly? I don't know. And frankly, I don't care because I came up with another solution. Here's my solution. Save it as an ORA file. What is ORA? You don't know what ORA is? Well, ORA is the native format of mypaint. Okay, so if I draw a picture in mypaint, this is going to get saved as a .ora file, and the .ora format can have layers. Okay, now there's a side issue that you might bring up, which is that, well Dave, you're going to lose your blending modes. Your Photoshop blending modes, your Krita blending, all your blending modes are going to be lost when you bring them into OpenToonz. And I stop you right there and say, yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter. Even if OpenToonz could successfully bring in Photoshop files, you're still not going to have your blending modes. So a question might arise, well, how do you do blending modes in OpenToonz? And it's actually pretty simple. You go into the FX schematic and you insert effects like this. You go insert effect, layer blending, or layer blending INO. INO assumes that there's 2 layers that are being fed into it, and standard layer blending effects just add that blending mode to the current layer, and any layers that are underneath it are affected by it. So the ones I tend to use are multiply, tend to be either multiply or overlay, which is pretty much the same as soft light, even though under the hood it's not exactly the same, but most people think of it as being kind of the same. So anyway, you can do blending modes in OpenToonz. You just have to set it up through the schematic, and you only get to see the effects when you render. Just like the blur on those leaves, I don't get to see it until I render. Okay, so if we want to bring, so the question is, how do we get to deal with multi-layer files and keep them all together and in a way that is friendly with OpenToonz? Well, you could save this as a KRA file, which is the native format of Krita, which you want to do anyway, no matter what, because of blending modes and other things. It's always wise to save your images as a Krita file. But just like if you're using GIMP, save it as an XCF file. If you're using Photoshop, save it as a PSD. But the question still remains, how do we get it into OpenToonz in terms of the individual layers? You might think, here's a great solution. Use this script, export layers. Well, except it doesn't work. What I found was if I exported the layers, first of all, if you export them as JPEGs, that's counterproductive because the output won't have alpha channels. If you export it as a ping, what I found was that the pings frequently come into OpenToonz corrupted. Okay? So what do? Well, it turns out that even though the scripted export function export as layers from Krita creates ping files that are problematic, when you save your Krita project as an ORA file, in other words, you save it as something that could be opened up in MyPaint, well, here's the dirty little secret about ORA files. The dirty little secret about ORA files is that an ORA file is actually a zip file. Okay? So if I take this ORA file and I make a copy of it and then I change the name or the extension to zip, and then I open that up in 7-zip, what you discover is that what the ORA file really is a zip file that contains a folder with ping images for each of your layers. Okay? And then a bunch of metadata. Oh, I'll open it again. And then metadata to describe the stack, and I haven't actually looked at this XML file to determine what the actual XML data is, but here we can take a look. And yeah, I mean the metadata tells you the opacity of your layers and things like that, and it even has, okay, this is interesting. This is actually really interesting. I didn't know this, but as you can see, it appears that it's using SVG compositing operations. That's kind of significant because it suggests that this XML file can probably be opened. I'm going to try it right now. Actually, this is kind of interesting. Okay, so let me get back and finish my story. The bottom line of my story is this. Because we know that actually an ORA file is nothing but a zip file, again, I can write a batch file, and this code looks pretty ugly, but what it does is it takes the ORA file, it changes its name to .zip instead of .ora, and then unzip is here in the same folder. It uses unzip to unpack the archive, and then it renames it back to an ORA file. So then when I run this batch file on an ORA file, which takes 1/4 of a second to do, I'm left with an ORA file and a folder that has the extension .ora.files, and that contains, lo and behold, all my ping images. And for whatever bizarre reason, those ping images come into OpenToonz clean as a whistle. So Krita creates an ORA file with clean ping images in it, but it does a batch export to layers as ping with pings that get corrupted. Why? I have no idea. And frankly, at this point, I don't much care. So, having said that, let's get back. And by the way, that's what I did here. Then I just took the pings that were extracted from the ORA. Now, you might say, well, that's kind of clunky, Dave. Trust me, it takes 1/4 of a second, and I'm always accessing this folder anyway. Okay? It's, because multi-layer files, that's where I'm keeping them. It's not inconvenient. Just trust me. It's not inconvenient. It's no big deal. Okay? And it's a lot more convenient than struggling with multi-level file formats that don't import cleanly. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You don't need that. Okay. So now the point I was getting at is that if we look here, this is you and me learning together now. If we go into the Keygampa exterior files and we go to the stack, let's change the name of the stack as well. Let's change the name of the stack to SVG. I'm betting you that, okay, you're being stupid. This is really supposed to open with Inkscape. So I'll do it this way. I'll open Inkscape manually from my launcher, and then I'll just drag and drop it. But being that it looks like this is probably properly qualified SVG, I should be able to open this in Inkscape as well. and it says it has a problem. So apparently that theory went the way of the buffalo. No big deal. I could expand my batch file so that it goes in here and deletes everything except the pings. You know, I mean, I could get more fancy schmancy with it, but basically this seems to work pretty well. So that's what I'm doing. If I need multi-level files, I save them in CRETA format or XCF GIMP format, but I export them as auras. That's what I bring into OpenToonz, is the pings from the auras. Okay, where does that leave us? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we now have another scene we need to tweak, and that, I believe, is 3B. This is the, we want to save all, by the way, because of that image getting changed. I should put on my glasses because I'm looking at the screen a lot here. So let's just sit tight here. Okay, so now we've got the tight close-up. All right, and right now this shot only consists of 2 keys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this frame, and I believe I determined that the right pace for her breathing is about 48 frames. So what I'm going to do is just go Alt down arrow and take this out to 96. All right. And then I'm going to drag this keyframe back to 48. And then I'm going to copy this keyframe. Control C. Control. I just hit Control C again. My bad. Control C. Control V. Okay. And what does that do for me? Well, if I set my preview range to 96 frames, now I can hit the L key and we get a nice breath. Okay? Sounds good. Sounds like the mail just came. Okay. I feel like maybe the breath in. Let's hit the L key. Okay, and now this actually brings up another kind of an interesting point about feature requests. What I did was I actually overrode the default geometric tool hotkey. Originally it was G. I changed my G key to be okay, hold on, let's just slow down here, folks. There's Akari, and I'm hitting various tools, and I think, see, I don't use the timeline a ton. I'm kind of new to the timeline, so I'm probably being stupid here. What I'm trying to do is simply grab Akari, and for whatever reason, like my flood fill tool can be used on a raster level. Okay, so let's grab the B key and see what happens. Mesh deformed level. Okay. If I wanted to do some painting, I'd have to come here. So that's fine. I wanna say this. As I've gone back to these earlier scenes, there are a number of sequences, like the one right here of her breathing, where these 2 frames, literally 2, well, it's one drawing, actually. It's not even 2. It's just one drawing deformed with the plastic tool. That one drawing is the entire scene, the entire shot. Well, originally, that animation was done in Blender and with the grease pencil. And I exported the whole animation as an image sequence. Why is that a stunningly bad idea? Number one, if you deal with raster levels like this, what if I needed to tweak and change the color of her hair slightly? I'm hosed. I mean, I could do it with post-production effects. I could do some masking and, you know, I could bring this image into Krita and tweak it that way. Yes, I could do that. But if this was a Toonz raster level, I could just go to the palette and just change the color. It would be literally take 1 second. Everything about using image sequences exported from some other program has proven to be way more trouble than it's worth. Now, in the previous scene, the birds flying by, that's different because all I have is the keyframes of the bird's wing positions, you know, like this, right? So there's probably a dozen drawings. So a set of keys that you're going to use somewhere else, that's kind of useful. But I'm making a really important distinction between tweening and timing. Tweening means all the drawings you need to tell your story are there. Timing has to do with taking those drawings and separating them out on a timeline in order to get the actual pacing of the final animation correct. What I've found is timing is something you leave until the very end. It's like the last step in the animation. You're seeing me do it right now, just like I did with the plastic tool. So tweening you do early, timing you do late. Well, when I'm exporting an image sequence of a completely animated action out of Blender, I'm committing to that timing. If the timing had to be tweaked in some way, I would have to literally go back to the Blender file and completely re-export the image sequence. It's really clunky. You don't want to do timing early. Why? Because when you're an editor, when you go to edit your show, the timing always changes. Did I say always? I meant to say always. So therefore, you put off the timing until late. So why did I tell you that? Because this is a raster image and I had forgotten. So getting back to my hotkeys is what I was talking about. I changed my hotkeys so that the F key does flood filling. Okay, the V key does the paintbrush. The B key, as usual, does the regular brush. And the G key does the eyedropper. The RGB eyedropper. Okay. My bad. Not the RGB. The R key is the RGB eyedropper. The G key, instead of the default, which is K, the G key is the style dropper. Okay, why did I make that change? Because now my brush, my paintbrush, my fill tool, my eyedropper, both the style dropper and the RGB eyedropper are all together on the keyboard. I can literally have my eyes shut and I can feel those 5 keys and they're all in the same place. Okay? Well, doing that freed up the K key, which I then reassigned to the geometric tool. But then today I thought, wait a second. The geometric tool is something I use very occasionally, once a month, right? Once in a while I'll use arcs for inking. But basically, I can click the geometric tool when I need it. Okay? But, and by the way, I just noticed a bug. I noticed a bug right now. You just saw it in real time. Look at that. OpenToonz is showing me that the G key is the geometric tool when it's not. The G key, for me, is the sampler. So that means that under the hood in the C++ code for OpenToonz, or maybe in some metadata that's like in an INI file or something, that little hint that has the G is baked into the code of the program. Okay, that's kind of stupid. Because what if I change the hotkey? Which I did. So what should happen is when OpenToonz loads or runs, it should be pulling those hints, those tooltips should be coming out of an INI file, and that INI file should be getting updated whenever you change your hotkeys. Okay, so that's a good example of a bug. It's not a deal breaker, it's not a big deal, but for some people it might be confusing if you're counting on the tooltips to tell you what the hotkeys are. Okay, so getting back to hotkeys, what I was getting at is that I actually overrode the K key again because I realized that there is no rewind tool in OpenToonz. So what I want is I want to be able to hit the L key to loop, but then when I stop, hit the K key to rewind to the beginning. Well, you could say, well, yeah, but in your user preferences, don't you have the ability to rewind after playback? Yes, it only works if you play back. and I have it set and it still doesn't work. I never hit the playback button. I always hit the loop button, even if I'm only going to watch it once. I go like that. Okay, then I hit the K key to rewind. So now the L and the K are right next to each other on the keyboard, so it's like really convenient to check things out, right? But here's where I noticed an opportunity. The I and the O key, right now the O key is mapped to the hook tool, which I like never, ever, 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 ever use. The only time I would ever use it is if I set up a puppet animation through the schematic, and then I used actually it's the animate tool I would use anyway. It isn't even I would use the skeleton tool, not the hook tool. I've never used the hook tool ever, not one time. So for me, the I and the O key are kind of freed up for hotkeys. Well, what might they be? Well, wouldn't it be cool to have the I and the O key, which are right above the playback and rewind button, set I for in point and O for out point. In other words, set start marker, set stop marker. Assign those to the I and the O key, so that now I have the in point, out point, playback and rewind all together on the keyboard. Well, guess what? I have bad news for you. It turns out that these little options to set the start marker and stop marker cannot be assigned to hotkeys. Can you believe it? I looked. There's no place where they can be assigned to hotkeys. It's insane. You have to click and set them this way. Which is unfortunate, because here's the thing. This is a good example that I always talk about. If you're just doing a little trivial 24 frame animation, no problem. You're not going to bump into this. But if you have an animation that's 6,000 frames long, because now you're at the end of the production cycle, and you have gone ahead and done what I did here, which is map out your timing. Well, guess what? You're going to often want to scroll to some place around frame 2000 and just go, let's set an in point and an out point, and let's just loop over that section, which maybe encompasses 2 or 3 shots. That sort of thing. Can't do it that simply. It would be nice. Now, is it the end of the world to have to do a little click? No, it's not the end of the world. But it would make a lot of sense to make the I and the O key map to in point and out point. Because it makes sense. I for in point, O for out point. Yada, yada, yada. And conveniently, the I key happens to be to the left, not the right, of the O key. So it all makes elegant sense. And that's certainly something I'm going to pass on to the developers. At the very least, set those hotkeys, or even better, just give us the ability to assign a hotkey to the start and end point. Okay, so now we've got to deal with the tint here. If I go to the tint level, that's interesting. Okay, yeah. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and map this to the okay, well, I'm talking gibberish. Okay, it appears that's interesting. Okay, I don't know. I need to open an X sheet. Yeah, this is the it's okay. There we go. Sorry, my bad. Okay, what I've been finding is, instead of spending a lot of time putting post-production effects in for color correction and tints and things like that, what I've sort of arrived at is, why not just have a level that's a Toonz raster level, and then anytime I want, if I wanted to completely change the color correction, it's like brain dead to do so. With one caveat: most of the time when I've been doing this, I've just been putting a solid color in, and what I'm finding more and more is that's not really what I want. What I really want is a gradient, so that I can actually do vignetting here. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit the Control X with the selection tool, and now this should be my airbrush. And when I do this, typically my airbrush, I'm going to hit the B key, is set really big. Okay, as you can see, it's pretty big. That's actually bigger than I need. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw in my vignette. And basically what's going to happen is most of this is going to be pretty transparent. I'm going to go ahead and make this big after all. Okay. Alright. And then around the edges, I'm going to let it be more opaque, but the whole point here is to create a color corrective layer that at the same time draws a little more attention to what we want the viewer to notice, which is Akari. So I'm getting the effects of color correction and vignetting in a single step. Okay? And you say, well, what if the color's not quite right? No problem. First of all, we can dial it in this manner. And second of all, normally with this vignetting stuff, I normally want a fairly dark blue, because it's nighttime, you know. So you see that looks about right. Okay, and with that, I'm going to save the project or save the scene. Control S, and then just hit Alt R and do the same thing I've been doing. Let OpenToonz turn this into an MP4, and in just a second, I'll just run this batch file one more time, because there's another MP4 that's going to appear in this folder, and I'll run that batch file, and 5 seconds later I will have an MJPEG AVI that I can drag into Blender and use for editing. Okay, so that brings us, and that, by the way, that shot's going to go right here. So that kind of brings us up to date. You can see that there are quite a few things that have changed in the show. Obviously this background image was completely redone and is legions better than it was. So again, I'm going through, I'm just tweaking the animation. Let's just look at this. You know, I sort of fine-tuned the pacing of how he climbs the wall. I added a plastic tool layer there to give a little more detail to his turn of the head, so it was smoother. Definitely looks better. You could complain about the fact that here his ponytail is blowing in the wind and here it's not. Do I care? I'm not sure. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I may add a, here you've got a tassel that's clearly forgotten later in the show. So I may need to add the tassel here, blowing in the wind again. I could probably literally use the same image sequence and just turn it sideways and put it behind his head, and it would look great. Okay, now here, because of some improvements I've made with my painting ability, probably the floor, certainly the background, yeah, right here, this whole sequence has to be broken up into pieces. So in terms of sort of finalizing the quality of the show, I'm up to this point. And that's why I haven't been doing any fresh animation, is because I've been going through and fine-tuning these scenes. So starting here, the floor here is wrong. Frankly, I think her hair is wrong. Here the wall is wrong. The floor is wrong there. The wall is wrong there. So there's a bunch of things that need to be tweaked. The way that I've gone about that, if you care, is by loading. Let's load. I believe I changed the name of this to bear with me, folks. I have to look at all these. Okay, I didn't. Okay, so let me open this up. What I keep doing is I've got this very, very long scene that has a lot of the early shots from the show, and what I've done is when I get to a shot that I need to redo, which oh, okay. Yeah, okay, so the whole, this needs to be moved downstream. The whole sequence with the foot on the wall is missing, so that needs to be addressed. Okay, so here it is. I didn't mean to turn on all these onion skins. Anybody who's followed me for any length of time knows I don't really do the onion skin thing. Okay, so what's going on here? Yeah. Okay, the way I'm going to deal with this, it's way easier to see on an X sheet for me, I must say. But okay, there's the shot. So what I'm going to do is grab these 3 shots and just delete them, and grab all these shots and delete them. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is grab this shot, and I'm going to explode the sub X sheet. Yep. Okay, so now here's the scene, and it really consists of 2 shots, which is kind of against the rules for me, but that's okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this scene as, and what would that be? We just had Ninja 2 struggling to climb the wall. And yes, and that's number 8. So I'm sort of adhering to a numbering convention here. All right. So we'll call this Ninja 2 Rock Falls. And it's just so I have a name that I can refer to. Okay, and so what I will do is this. Honestly, this shot's pretty close to good already. The only thing I can think of is probably a tint level. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create a Toonz raster level, and I want to keep this one really simple. See, this is why I don't like the timeline for what I'm doing here. Okay, hold on. Okay, hit the Z key. This makes no sense for me. What I want to do is just go to the end here of the X sheet and hit the B key. Okay, so all that did for me was it created a level, and I typically by convention call it tint. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is the same thing I've been doing, which is take my airbrush, make it pretty big, and I'm just going to do the same thing I've been doing. Okay. Now I don't want it to be too extreme. So that's actually why I like having this fairly large airbrush, because I want it all to be covered so that it's all tinted. Okay. But then out here towards the edges, I want it to be to the point of being almost black, as you can see. So it just gives me a little bit of vignetting. And of course you could do the vignette separate from the color correction. No problem. Okay, so that looks fine. So just a little bit of blue because it is nighttime. And then let's just crank the alpha down and just dial it in until it feels about right. Okay, and now because we do have 2 shots baked in here, presumably I'm sort of playing it safe. I think I probably did that in such a way that it's still going to look good for the second shot. I mean, yes and no. I think that maybe it's too much. I'll tell you what we're going to do. Actually, I got a simple solution. Hit the B key. Boom. Let's just do 2 of them. That's the nice thing about doing tint work in the way I'm doing it. Because now what I can do is just follow the same thing I've been doing. I know I basically got it dialed in here. Let me make this just a little bit darker on this shot. Okay. And so that way, what I can do is just interactively get it to where we want it to be. Okay, I want a little bit of a highlight down here where the rock lands, and I want this clearly should be pretty dark. Little kiss right here of, you know, light. All right, so let's crank the yeah, now we can't really change the alpha. Actually, what I should do, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go, watch this. Okay, I'm using this palette entry to tint the first picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control C, Control V, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the fill tool, okay, rectangular, and it's going to do lines and areas, and I'm going to take this color right here and turn it like stupidly red. Now watch what's going to happen. By doing a fill operation on this level, okay, I just moved all that color over to this palette entry instead of this one, so I can actually have a completely different color correction on each shot. Now normally I would want this broken into 2 shots, but the way we're doing it here is okay. So now if I do the same thing again, let me try this. Okay, that effectively got rid of it completely. Now I'm going to switch to this palette entry, and what I wanted to do, the reason I did that is because I wanted this one to be a little darker, a little denser. So I'm going to turn the alpha up a bit. What's going on here? Something seems to be wrong. Oh, got it. Gotta switch it to the airbrush. Sorry. Okay, so stop everything. Let's do that fill operation one more time, because I kind of effectively broke things by having the wrong brush. So let's make sure, got the airbrush, cool. And it looks like it still doesn't want to do it, so that's it. Obviously I could create a new level. However, what I'm going to do is stretch this back out here. Go here. Let's just try kind of a reboot and see if that is more effective. Because that actually, yeah, that created a new drawing. That's what we wanted. Okay, so now what we're going to do is really dial in the color correction here. And then we'll come back and modify the alpha to make it all look good. Okay, so now what we're going to do is take it away from blue and towards black, but we want to have a little bit of a blue tint. And by the way, we definitely need to have this tinted as well, just not as much. And now we can dial in that shot. Looks pretty good. Okay. And I actually think that should be even more blue. Alright. And there it is. Okay, so save, and again, Alt-R. Just let OpenToonz render that up for me. And by the way, if I come back here, here you can see that we've got that one shot. Boom, it just got converted to a right there. And now we're going to go back to Blender, and we're going to stick this here. My bad. It goes here. Wide, closer, closer. Okay, and just so you know, these 2 shots are going to have to be modified to put a slight camera move in them so that they actually still are continuing to push in. Okay. No big deal. And so now we've got these shots. Hey you, let's try that again. Go. Boom. Okay, and this should be the shot that I just did. So if I come back here, I'm sure it's done rendering. I'm going to close that Aura folder, by the way. So I'm going to run the batch file, and there it is. Instant MJPEG. So you can see it does not take very long to convert to MJPEG. Okay, so now again we're getting really good performance. I have noticed that this opening shot tends to bog down. It's still got great seek times, but it does play back a little bit poorly compared to any other shot, and I'm not sure why that is. I'm going to look into it. Everything else seems to play back no problem at 24 frames a second. So we need to have a push in for this shot, and a little more push in for this shot. I would make the comment that this shot is not quite dark enough. It needs a vignette. This shot is too blue. So those are notes that I would make, and go back and just do a quick re-render after I fix them in OpenToonz. Okay. So I gotta say, the OpenToonz Krita Blender Triumvirate is definitely doing well. Alright, let's just rewind a little bit here. Okay, something's wrong with this shot. I don't know where his... Okay. Okay, yes. So this is cool. What's going on here is that this scene is simplified. This doesn't actually have its timing worked out. So, and the only stuff that's in this scene is actual changes from frame to frame. In other words, this is nothing but a list of keyframes. The actual, this is why I made a distinction between tweening and timing. Okay? I failed to take an extra step here, which is I need to take this shot and actually time it out now. So, no big deal. Typically, the way I would do that is I would just go to one frame, and let's see. In this case, I would probably... Okay, I would probably... I would have a little bit of a pause there. So that takes us to about a half a second. Okay. So let's play that. Yeah. K key. Okay. So actually what I would like to do is make the initial pause a little longer. Okay. And the plastic tool animation is right now appears to be on 1s, and it really should be on 2s. It's too smooth actually. But so I'm gonna say I'm gonna literally give that 1/2 of 1 second. Yep. Okay, and then this progression feels slightly long, but let's roll that back to 1/4 of a second. Okay, and then let's have just a... Can we get like a pause right there? Let's see how that feels. Okay, yeah, this bit right here is way too protracted and smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and... Whoops. What I'm looking for, by the way, what I'm looking for is a pause right here. I should probably just be doing this with my mouse. Okay, right here, I want to have a... Right there. I want that to hold. Okay. Let me check what... I guess that's a little patch thing. Okay. So it seems to me I think it's... Sorry, I don't know my hotkeys yet. There we go. Shift or Control key to expand this out. I think what we want to do is go Control C, go 1 frame forward, Control V. Okay. Okay, so we'll ignore the, you can see the problem with the rock right here. This, oh, I tell you, I can't do this. I've got to use the X sheet. I find the timeline extremely cumbersome. Okay, so yep, so what we need to do here is extend that down. Yeah, I mean, that's probably about right. Let's give that a try. K key to rewind. Ah, not bad. Boom. I like that. That's snappy. The only thing that's wrong is this part right here. That needs to be on 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that, and boy, oh boy, this is going to be a hoot. So we've got, believe it'd be, unfortunately I have to be able to show this on YouTube is almost impossible because I can't get this thing out of the way. Okay, so we got that, and then we got the hold. So it's actually these keys right here. These keys need to be step 2. Let's apply it. It looks like it just did the 1. That's what I was afraid of. Yeah. So all of these need to be modified to be. Normally this wouldn't have happened because the initial animation would have been on 2s to begin with. Got a little patch there I can see causing a problem, but look at what we see is this is still changing every frame. So the only way I can fix this, unfortunately, is to go through every single one of these levels, because it won't do multiple levels. That's another feature request, man. To not be able to edit multiple levels is, you know, in terms of this kind of stuff, like changing the keyframe interpolation, is a little bit silly. But okay, and I will stop boring the YouTube audience at this point. This is still on 1s. Nothing, including an act of God, seems to be suitable to solve that problem. So I'm gonna have to surgically fix this because it's really, really obnoxious. Yeah. Yeah, it's way too smooth. It looks, actually doesn't look like an anime. So I think with that, man, I've been going for over an hour and a half. So I'm going to call that good for today, and that brings pretty much up to date, because now I'm just going through and fixing these things and getting things rendered and getting things edited, and then I'll be moving on to probably creating some sort of introductory statement, and I need to deal with the soundtrack. Sound effects, voices, music. So that's all on the agenda. So anyway, that's it for now.